Hello, folks. This is the SIG Cluster Lifecycle's AWS Cluster API Implementation Working Group, or subproject. It's more of a subproject, I think. And we only have one agenda item today, which is Jason has a doc, which is a distillation of requirements around an MVP that Heptio plans on working on, and we can kind of talk about how this overlaps with other requirements that other folks might have, and who might be able to contribute to what going forwards on an MVP. So Jason, if you want to share your screen.
Yep.
And walk it through.
See if I can find the right window. All right. Can everybody see the document?
Yes.
All right, and this is the same document that's linked in the agenda notes as well. So going through, we had a few different documents created from the kickoff meeting. One of them was a basic requirements doc. Another one was a lessons learned doc. And I tried to kind of distill both of those to come up with a distilled kind of MVP that we can target for the initial implementation. Going through, there were some things that weren't exactly defined in the requirements list. So the filling in gaps from the feature list right here is just me trying to codify some of those gaps. So one of them is we don't mention IAM roles or instance profiles at all. So for the MVP, figuring it was the path of least resistance and most amenable for end users would be to require a predefined set of IAM roles and instance profiles to be used. That way, we're not requiring end users to give credentials to the controllers here to actually create those things. Because we know that's an issue for some organizations. And then we also don't mention security groups. So just putting down security groups can be created on demand, or we can use predefined ones for the MVP. The other thing that we don't really go into detail with the requirements doc is the actual bootstrapping steps. And for Heptio's use, we would like to require pre-baked images that already contain the binaries required as input. And we would also prefer to go with a cloud init-driven approach for kind of driving kubeadm. And then also exposing the kubeadm config within the provider config for providing customization.
So I want to pause there and get feedback from other folks. This is what we will throw down Heptio. We plan on executing on, but that doesn't mean we can't work within the community if other folks want to implement something different to help create abstraction layers for some of this stuff and have the discussion points here and now. This is for the first initial bootstrapping of some of this stuff that we were talking about for an MVP. This doesn't include the flavors like EKS versus the other one, at least not yet. Does this make sense? Everyone's cool with this? Nadir's got 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, it looks pretty good. I think that as long as we accept that other people will have different requirements and make sure whatever provider config looks right to accommodate those future options, that's fine. This looks fine as a first step.
David, do you have thoughts?
No, I like it. I know there are people who are going to complain about the pre-baked images, but I think this is a reasonable choice.
Okay. One of the things that we had talked about with regards to pre-baked images is we have external tooling, which we could probably donate to the community somewhere with regards to baking images for KubeADM. Just because it's on Heptio assets right now, but we can absolutely give to community to make it more community focused for some of these things, so that way the image baking can be generic for everyone in the community can contribute to that and make it push forwards.
And my view is that I know we're not assuming KubeADM, but I'm assuming KubeADM. So, and the reason I'm assuming KubeADM is I don't think people really care about which underlying operating system they're running. So that's the reason I'm not too concerned about this. As long as we provide images that work for most people, I think that's a good starting point.
So here's a question that I don't know the answer to, and that Jason brought up too. Should we, as royal we, as a SIG or community or whatever, be publishing canonical images as part of a release? That gets into weird space, right?
I feel like we have to. If we want to trust that our documentation works, we have to provide all of the bits and pieces. Otherwise, there's room for error and there will be problems for people. It'll lead to a bad user experience.
I mean, I like the idea of having a default set of images, you know, to ease that on-ramping kind of initial experience. Because requiring baking those images is kind of a hurdle to get people over to be able to consume this.
What did the EKS folks think? Ishi?
Tim, I have a question. Since I'm new, forgive me if I need to ask questions. So the pre-baked images implies some sort of an army that has an OS and also will have different OS for the control plane components or system D services. Is that what we mean by pre-baked images?
Yep, that's exactly what I mean.
So then we have a pre-baked image for the control plane as well as the data plane. Yes?
For the control plane. I don't know what you mean by data plane.
By data plane, you'd have kubelets and kubeproxy running on the worker nodes, essentially.
You'd have pre-baked images that have all of the necessary bits to stand up the control plane, where I consider the kubeproxy and the kubelets themselves as part of the control plane. The data plane I consider to be the workloads actually running on Kubernetes.
Yeah, so what I mean to say is the worker army or the worker pre-baked image versus the master pre-baked image. I think I'm understanding you right. For EKS, we already provide the EKS worker node army. We publish it. So I think it would make sense to actually publish the worker node army as well. And I guess that makes sense from the control plane standpoint.
Now this is kind of specific to an implementation detail that we Heptio want to work on. This doesn't include like flavorings as I know Chris was working on to determine like nomenclature for us to talk about. Like if folks wanted to pick EKS, we absolutely want to have the capabilities in this implementation of Cluster API for people to spin up EKS clusters.
Yeah.
But what we, Heptio, not the royal we, so I'm gonna have to like preface my we's, I don't know, I'll just start saying Heptio. What Heptio is probably gonna work on first is just providing that base KubeADM control plane layer for folks to just bootstrap and get rolling. And if folks are willing to execute for the EKS flavor, that we can provide some of that abstraction in the provider config.
Makes sense. One another dumb question. This might be obvious to others, but I have to ask it. Is this initiative primarily driven to allow all the tools to converge on a common standard so that people can then use one way of deploying a minimal cluster?
That's a broader question. The purpose of this one is to make it easy to support one-to-N clusters through a centrally managed MEDA control plane. Ideally, this would be a standard, but it remains to be seen. Standards are always, like you always said, fourth an initiative. I don't want to like go into this thinking that this will become the shiny city on the hill. I want to do step one first.
Makes sense, but the basis of it will most likely be kubeadm, and then you want to scale from one cluster to N clusters. That's the hope.
Yeah,
Okay.
the idea, imagine in a world you could have support for your kubeadm clusters and your EKS clusters, and you'd have the meta control plane that allows you to be able to get information and scale and manage those clusters.
Got it.
All right, I've interrupted enough. I'll hand it back to Jason.
All right. The next section that I have here are kind of deferred features. And again, this is going off of that enumerating state space doc. And mostly this was done just to kind of scope down the amount of work for the MVP. So the first one is anything that would relate to potential impedance mismatches with the current cluster API definitions. And for that, I put the EKS-based deployments and the auto-scaling groups because those don't necessarily mesh in exactly with the machine actuator interface. There might be some extra work to kind of shoehorn those in to fit properly with cluster API. So that's generally why we avoided those two topics.
No, I'm gonna interrupt you again because that's my job.
Yep.
David or others who have already implemented stuff like this, what are your thoughts here? Because I know that's a big topic in the larger cluster API conversation. Nothing?
So Red Hat's, I was just going to say, from Red Hat's point of view, this is fine. We're not using any of these features right now. And so actually, we moved away from auto-scaling groups to individual machines.
Any motivation or reason behind that?
So there were things that were going to be harder with auto-scaling groups. We thought, just like, we want to take a specific machine out of circulation. We want to, stop all the workload on it first, drain it, and then it's a lot easier to stop those in individual machines. Although you could detach it from an ASG first, but it just gives you more control to work with the individual machines.
Yeah, but there's going to be speed issues, right?
Sure. And for what we need, just dealing with individual machines is enough for now.
Other folks? Nishi, David?
So right now, we've implemented our provider using machines. I think that's fine for small scale deployments. And I like the fact that you've grouped the EKS and auto scaling groups together because I think the reason they're difficult is related. Anyway, I don't think that it's viable long term to use machines as your primary means of manipulating the cluster. Part of the problem that we have is users can create machines or controllers can create machines. If we wanted to implement ASGs or EKS controllers, those controllers would have to create the machines for the user. And so we have sort of an inconsistent owner of the machine object. Is it a user or is it an ASG controller? I think we need to resolve that. I don't think that I have an answer for it in this meeting. So I think it's a fair place to say we're deferring this decision, but I think we have to solve it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just didn't want to try to burn time on trying to solve those problems to get to the MVP state right now.
Any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns on those bullet points? Just in case you're wondering, I'm going to interrupt on every major bullet point. So let's just pause there, and you can do the moderation then.
All right. Moving on. The next deferred feature is separate control of public and private network selection between the control plane and the workers. The feature document actually lists public, private for control plane and worker nodes separately. To kind of scope things down for the MVP, I kind of booted being able to select those independently. Does anybody see any issues with that, or any specific use case that we would want to target that individual selectivity for the MVP?
So on our end, we would like to be able to select which nodes are on a public network and versus the private network. Particularly if you have a server that's part of a hybrid cloud, right, where some workload is communicating via VPN to your internal network versus other workload, which is considered public. It would be useful to say, I mean, not between the control plane and the nodes, just the nodes. To say.
So you're thinking more generically, kind of grouping public and private to a subset of machines.
Right. Per machine set. Right.
All right. Is that something that you're thinking needs to be part of the MVP, or is that something that you think?
No, that's something that could eventually be introduced, so not really part of the MVP. So yeah, it's fine to defer it.
Okay. All right. Thanks for clarifying, Caesar.
Hey, Jason, Nishi here. Could you explain that sentence a little bit? What does it mean when you say separate control of public or private network?
So I can skip down here to the kind of diagrams that I created. Basically, the first one's kind of like a fully public network, single AZ deployment of both the control plane and workers. And the second one is basically a private networking single AZ where both the control plane and the workers are in a private subnet. The API server is exposed through a public ELB, and any other access to the host would be through a bastion instance. That's kind of where public and private is coming from. Does that clarify it at all?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
But also, too, if folks are willing and want to work on things, we don't want to. This is what we have spec'd out, as in we as in Heptio. So I have to preface it that we will execute on, but for an MVP within like a reasonable time frame that we will try to work on. But if other folks are willing to throw down and have resources to execute on these pieces, we'd absolutely welcome them and would want to have them part of the development process.
I think the only reason I put it down maybe for MVP is just because EKS itself is a public endpoint, but the worker nodes you want most people probably want in a private subnet. But that's gonna, I wouldn't expect kubeadm provision things to be done in the same way.
And I do see value in being able to kind of trigger them independently. It's just, you know, for the sake of the MVP, scoping it down kind of to a more minimal feature set makes sense.
So would the choice be made cluster-wide, like selecting, like setting a default for the subnet? Is that how you would do it?
So in this case, the public versus private would more be what Chris is talking about with flavors, where there's like a public flavor and a private flavor, basically.
Okay.
The next one for deferred features was multi-AZ based deployments. And the main reason why I sat there and wanted to defer that was because once we get there, then that starts complicating how we deploy things to make sure that we're spreading evenly between the AZs that we're targeting. When we're deleting, you know, having to make sure that we're balancing load and potentially anything that we would have to deal with persistent volumes, having to worry about those being available in the right AZ for the right instance. Not to say that we wouldn't want to, you know, follow on, you know, after the MVP adding it. I think it's definitely a valuable use case to do that. It just seemed like a lot of complexity for the initial MVP.
Yeah, I thought in the cluster API workgroup we had talked about doing that up higher in the stack, right? So so your machine set needs to be aware of your different AZs so that it can spread machines out or whatever. And I think the hurdle there is figuring out if there's an equivalent to in every cloud that implements cluster API. But yeah, that makes sense.
All right. Moving on again. The next deferred features are related to instance creation. And basically for the MVP, I wanted to try to avoid dealing with placement groups, dedicated instance tenancy, and spot instances. Again, just to kind of scope down the work for the MVP.
What do you mean by placement groups?
So the placement groups are being able to put multiple instances in a placement group for kind of resource reasons. So faster access to the resources.
It's a best effort placement strategy so that you can have nodes that have locality.
Got it.
All right. The next one, the next few are around accessibility. The first one, purely private API server access. I wanted to try to avoid that just for simplicity of the MVP. I figure the most common generic use cases for the people who would be willing to try out the cluster API generally would not have issue with the publicly accessible API server. And then we could look at, you know, how we can support, you know, purely private access down the line. And similarly, the VPC private link, you know, very related to that same topic.
Makes sense. Yeah.
All right. All right, and the next few items were all related to wanting to default to pre-baked images and leveraging kubeadm for deployment. More generic custom CRI configuration, custom kubelet configuration, arbitrary bootstrap script support, and custom API server configuration. For the MVP, we wanted to limit the configuration to just the configuration that's available through the kubeadm config.
I have a meta question for folks. What CRIs, other than Red Hat, which I already know the answer, what CRIs are folks using by default currently for their cluster standups? Because in 1.12, this is going to change. Not CNI, CRI. David. So like containerd versus cryo versus Docker something.
Docker.
So the problem with
containerd, but it's Docker right now.
The problem with Docker, and there's issues with the current configuration for 1.12, and I'll have to point folks at issues, but we need to spec out a default for kubeadm, and right now currently it's looking like containerd for the 1.12 cycle.
I think we'd be fully supportive to go in that direction. From the AWS side.
Do folks have opinions? We didn't actually specify here CNI, and I do know that there's many CNI. If we're going to do pre-baked images, there's a trade-off of part of the baking might be a parameter to specify your CNI. I don't know if
right now the CNI would be configured through the add-ons.yaml if using cluster cuddle. So it's just specified as an additional YAML that's applied after the worker or the control plane and the workers are brought up.
I'm just trying to think about the UX experience for that. We could talk about that one later.
Yeah.
I don't know the state of CSI either. I would imagine everyone for AWS would default to the cloud provider, but people are different.
So on that point, we are working on a proposal for CSI support on EBS. Right now, the volume controller will stay as it is, but going forward, we'll provide a migration path for the volume controller to map onto the CSI driver. So it should be fine if we assume cloud provider is the path forward.
I would give that a thumbs up. Does anyone disagree?
Agreed.
And that said, you could still end up with CRI customization through pre-baked images and the kubeadm config file as well. It's just not as nice of a kind of experience as we could potentially offer in the future for that.
But the long-term expected behavior would be to force folks to use the pre-baked images, or as long as you make a pre-baked image that follows the pattern, as long as we make our own images that follow the pattern, it's irrelevant. Like, can we seed this with our own images?
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
The idea would be the only requirements for this MVP that I'm proposing would be that kubeadm, the kubelet, and kubectl are installed on the system, and some of the requirements around that. it's
Okay.
pretty minimal.
That's fine. I deal with a bunch of customers that get hung up on the concept of whose neck can they choke, who can they point blame at. Therefore, there's a bunch of enterprise support issues that come up, even though they're adopting Kubernetes. So just trying to keep my eye on the forward looking. Thanks. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries. And then the last item on the deferred features was deploying etcd to dedicated hosts. For most of the clusters that we're targeting for the MVP, we're looking at relatively small clusters. So hosting etcd on the same host as the control plane shouldn't be an issue.
So, Jason, actually, I had a question about the previous item, the arbitrary bootstrap script support. Is that only for control plane machines or for regular compute nodes that you bring up? Like, would I not be able to specify my user data for those?
So we were hoping to limit the MVP to targeting the customization being limited to the pre-baked image and the kubeadm config that's passed in, rather than providing kind of arbitrary customization through the user data.
Okay, maybe that's one thing we can, on the Red Hat side, we can contribute. We definitely need our own user data on compute nodes that we bring up.
Yeah, I definitely see there's a possibility to provide more of a generic interface around the bootstrapping steps. And I think that's something valuable that we can probably provide not just for the AWS provider, but also for the cluster API in general.
Yeah, that seems very meta. I don't know if that's, we could talk about that during the cluster API meeting too.
This is Kyuho from EKS. So I have a question on the deploying etcd on dedicated host. So if we do that, are we gonna have a separate image for etcd, or how that's gonna work out?
The master images versus the worker images, or the control plane images versus the worker images, sorry.
So if we're talking about dedicated etcd, the way that we would probably prefer to manage it is the way that the static manifest deployed etcd that we've defined through the kubeadm docs. So it would basically be the exact same bootstrapping image as any of the other hosts, but there are definitely possibilities for other implementations as well.
We could have one AMI to rule them all if we wanted to, because it's not going to take up that much extra space to put all the containers in one image versus another. Ideally, we wouldn't need containers or access to the outside world just to do the bootstrapping portion. That's up to other people.
I would think we would defer kind of pre-baking the actual container images for the first go. I think that would be a later optimization that we could target.
I want to make sure this is, the community understands that this is a decision that we, Heptio, have said that we are going to execute on. And it's not by no means the only way or the only path, but this is these are the pieces that we plan to execute on. We will resource this on our side. Are there areas like Caesar mentioned wanting to add user data. Are there other areas that folks would like to help in or contribute on or be a part of? Or just, I want to make sure that other folks are involved and understand that this is not us trying to, push the community. I want the community to say, this is what we will resource. And the community can say other things too as well. If you want other things to work on, and we'll try to do our level best to accommodate.
Hey, Tim, from AWS side, we'll come back to you on specific areas where we can help out with this particular proposal and taking that action item.
Yeah, because in an ideal world, if AWS was able to resource like the EKS flavor in the beginning somehow and get that rolling, that would be great. But I recognize that everybody's resource strapped in some way, shape, or form around there. David, I know you guys had a separate implementation. Did you plan on executing or helping to work on some of this stuff?
We do. It's not, well, take that back. It's become higher priority recently. I think that we were mostly interested in an EKS implementation. So I'm still thinking through in my head how this relates and whether we would be interested in pushing that forward as a priority. The main reason being, we think it's going to be simpler and cheaper to use EKS. I might be wrong about the cheaper part, but
from our side, we absolutely want to fast follow with EKS after we get the first MVP done. But if folks want to work on it now, we'd happily try to help with the abstraction pieces and provider configuration to make it possible. But we have decided that like we only have so many resources to be able to do this.
And the other main driver for not focus on EKS initially for the MVP would be to kind of get an implementation out there sooner rather than later as well, because we still have to solve some of the kind of impedance related issues around EKS with Cluster API as well.
You want to drop some details there about what you mean?
Well, just in general, EKS tends to prefer targeting auto-scaling groups rather than individual machines for the kind of worker node groups and that sort of thing. That's the one that stands out most in my mind.
You unmuted David, so I was thinking you were going to say something. No?
Accident.
On the Red Hat side, we're at this point we're more interested on the machine management part of the equation, not so much the control plane. So that's definitely an area we can help contribute to the machine actuator, whatever else is needed there.
So I actually do have a question. Jason, you've prototyped something. How do you envision committing that to upstream? We have a repo. Is that something that you guys would start splitting up and PRing individually?
So we probably won't lift and shift too much from the POC that we did over because the POC we did was very opinionated to the point that most of the settings were and configuration was hard coded in the implementation. But we may, it'll basically be mostly a lessons learned to apply. There may be some code that we can kind of lift and shift, but probably not the majority of it, truthfully.
I do have questions about like group-wide utility tools around AWS and sort of best practices that I was hoping to leverage. I know that Chris was going to work on that document with regards to like utility wrappers. In an ideal world, it would be great to have like a canonical set of utility wrappers to help support the idea of idempotency for doing certain operations, because I know that that's a big kicker for a lot of folks. She's going to be out for a while, but I don't know if other folks had thoughts or opinions there. I opened an issue today to start to get those things in there, because I think nothing that we wrote down, or nothing that Jason wrote down on that doc, precludes folks from getting started on this. And anybody's welcome to join if they want to help with that effort. But do folks have any thoughts with regards to best practices and utility functions that make a ton of sense to leverage? Because there's COPS, there's Kubicorn, everyone's got their own implementation already somewhere. We have ours. You know, we kind of want to put all of that in a meat grinder and come out with like the best, and just kind of leverage a common set of core utility functions.
I'm still a bit unsure about what some of the things the cluster API will do. Like, will it create VPCs or will it not? I think those kind of questions decide what kind of utility functions we need.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, for the MVP, we're looking at by default creating a VPC if one is not specified already. The subnet, you know, there's a subnet below that to, you know, for the AZ that we're targeting. The security groups for the control plane and the worker nodes. The load balancer that we're going to use, you know, pretty much all of the infrastructure, you know, south of, you know, the IAM role and instance profiles that we're going to require be passed in and pre-created.
Yeah, so I think we probably have a bunch of stuff which isn't Kubernetes related, but related to just generally provisioning stuff and not screwing up when you want to go multi-region, for example, that might be in the first instance is just best encoded as documentation, and then might be something more UX immediately later on.
Yeah, this is the kind of detailed information that I think helps, because there's a large user pool of information that we want to leverage in putting in the community repo, that we don't want to repeat the same mistakes yet again in another implementation. So I'll try to reach out. I don't know where that document lives. I know Chris planned on working on that. Does anyone else know where that might live?
Are you talking about the best practice or the lessons learned document?
The lessons learned document.
Yep. I'll paste that in chat here.
Okay. Do folks have other things they want to discuss? I think we're actually over time.
I just had a question. So what are the next steps? We do have a PR open for the proposal for machine config. I wasn't sure if that's, you know, when's a good point to start working on that, if that's good to be accepted as a first step, or what? But yeah, what are the next steps?
I think what makes a ton of sense is to take this doc and in the implementation and put in the repo in some way, shape, or form for broad consumption, and start to break down a backlog. I'm going to probably defer to Jason and Chuck to have opinions on the machine API implementation and get them on the review hook. I'll kind of be like the arbiter, for lack of a better term, and try to make sure that the ships keep on running. So feel free to poke me if you want me to get something moving along. But I think we should probably get someone on the review for that one, get the doc into sort of a spec form in the repo with a reference, and then also a bunch of clauses that outline, like, we're going to potentially address this in the next milestone. So I think it's on our responsibility right now to get the backlog doc in place and get reviews started to get rolling. And I think just open issues and PRs. I think right now we're kind of putting signs up now and saying open for business.
Sounds good.
Are there any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns?
Question, Tim, what is the timeline for the first release that we have in mind?
Ideally, when we discussed it internally, we would like to go along with the 112 release cycle just to get something out there. So at in an ideal world, alpha hits at the same time as 112. We don't want to do anything before alpha, so that will always be our gator. But I know that Google is trying really hard too to make alpha hit in 112 or right after 112 if possible.
Okay, thank you.
Any other last questions, comments, complaints, concerns?
One more question. Is this a bi-weekly meeting, weekly meeting?
I didn't set it up, so I don't know. I think Chris set it up.
It's weekly at the moment.
Yeah, I think the goal was to be weekly to begin with, and then we can switch to bi-weekly is when it's, when we have less to talk about.
So hopefully by next meeting, we'll have a doc to talk about and some PRs up and some issues created, and we can start to talk about logistics. Sound good? All right, last time. Any other last questions, comments, complaints, concerns? Going once?
Is there somewhere to get the list of documents that the group is using regularly?
That's a really good point. I think we should PR something to the repo, because right now I have trouble finding them all.
Yeah, that was kind of the intent about the first part of putting the docs into the repo itself. I'm going for round 3 now, but this is good stuff. All right, I got a hard stop, so I'm just going to say, wow. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.